We're going to talk now about the political backgrounds of the New Testament. A general timeline of Palestine would go something like this. Alexander the Great conquered the Palestine area in 332 BC, and that kind of ushered in the Greek Hellenistic cultural influence on that part of the world. He died an untimely death, and his two generals split his kingdom. The Seleucid dynasty, which ended up being based out of Syria, and then the Ptolemy dynasty, which was based out of Egypt, then were two sort of warring factions, if you will, that fought for control of Judea from the death of Alexander the Great until 167 BC. Generally speaking, the Seleucid dynasty ruled Palestine. The last of those rulers was Antiochus, who was particularly bent on Hellenizing the Jewish population to the point that he began to prohibit the free exercise of religion for Jews, and also desecrated the temple in pretty significant fashion. And so there was a priestly family, the Hasmoneans. Perhaps you've read or heard of the Maccabean Revolt. This was the family that basically rose up and led Judea to independence. Mattathias and then his son Judah were two of the primary characters. You can read about that in the book of Maccabees. It's commemorated. Actually, their purification of the temple is commemorated by Hanukkah. So we have this interlude in time from about 167 to 63 BC, when actually there's peace and they're independent. And of course, Rome comes in and conquers Palestine in 63 BC. The details of all that aren't really pertinent to our conversation. Just want to give you a little bit of the background of what's going on. Now, thinking about some of the Roman rulers and those that we have touch points with in the New Testament. There were 8 emperors, Roman emperors, during the New Testament period. The first, who was also considered to be the first Roman emperor, was Caesar Augustus. He came to power by defeating Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. And he basically came to power and was an absolute ruler. He was elevated both in life and in death to the level of a god. His title was Imperator Caesar Divi Filius, which means son of God. And so he was the emperor at the birth of Christ. So when Jesus was born, Augustus was the emperor of Rome. His son, Tiberius, actually it was his adopted son and also his stepson. He became emperor in AD 14 and ruled until AD 37. Now he is important to us for a couple of reasons. It's during his reign that Jesus was crucified, but more importantly and interestingly, Tiberius, he had moments of time during his rule when he just kind of checked out, and he had a guy named Sejanus who was basically his regent who ruled in his place. Sejanus was a known anti-Semite. He also was responsible for appointing Pontius Pilate as procurator of Judea. Now, that's interesting because Sejanus and Pilate would have shared the same views. And we know that from reading Scripture in Luke chapter 13, that Pilate killed Jewish worshipers and then mixed their blood with sacrifice, which is a really horrible thing to do. Clearly, Pilate was very anti-Semitic in the way he approached the Jews and his rule over them. But then we have this picture of Pilate that's much more conciliatory towards the Jews and much more even towards Jesus in his trial. It doesn't seem to match up. The two caricatures of Pilate seem quite different. Interestingly enough, Sejanus was accused of treason and then executed in 30, I believe it was 31 AD. Now that's important because this is prior to Jesus' crucifixion, and so basically Pilate was in a much more precarious position politically when Jesus was tried. And I'm pretty sure that if it had happened prior to Sejanus being executed, Pilate probably would have released Jesus just to spite the Jews. But because Sejanus had been executed, Pilate didn't have the backing in Rome any longer. In fact, he was probably in danger of his career and his life. And so anything that happened in Judea to draw attention would have been bad for him. And so he was eager to quell any kind of tensions that might have been rising there in Jerusalem. So it makes a little more sense when you compare sort of the caricature of Pilate in Luke 13 with the Pilate that presided over Jesus' trial. We understand a little more just by knowing the background of what was happening. The next emperor was Gaius Caligula in AD 37, or he ruled for only 4 years. And he was the great nephew of Tiberius. He was mentally deranged. He was convinced of his own divinity. He's remembered most for just his conflict with the Jews. He actually tried to have his image set up in the temple in AD 40, but was talked out of it by Herod Agrippa. Claudius, his uncle, became emperor. Claudius was he wasn't much to look at, I guess, on the outside. He had a limp. He drooled saliva. He was thought to be a half-wit, but at the same time, he was well-read and educated. Reminds me of myself. Anyway, he was a good statesman, and he was the one responsible for adding Britain to the empire. And biblically speaking, he was the one in Acts chapter 18, verse 2, who had the Jews expelled from Rome. Now, that's also interesting because that fact, biblical fact, is also supported by the Roman historian Suetonius, who says that he had the Jews expelled from Rome because of the disturbances associated with Christus, is who he calls Christus, or Jesus, Christ, I'm sure is who he was referring to. So then we have Nero, who's the next emperor from AD 54 to AD 68. Most of us are familiar with Nero. I won't say much about him other than that, of course, Rome was burned under his reign. He was a bit of a crazy guy, responsible for a lot of Christian persecution in the aftermath of the fire. As I'm sure you've read, it's presumed that he did it on purpose and scapegoated the Christians. Peter and Paul were both martyred during his reign, as were many, many others. Vespasian was the next Roman emperor from AD 69 to 79. He was a bit of a departure from the other emperors. He wasn't so much a politician as he was a military strategist. He was a military man in general. His grandfather was actually just a centurion, so he wasn't really from nobility per se, and so he wasn't as into the emperor cult, and all of that went along with that. In fact, on his deathbed, he's quoted as saying, "I think I'm becoming a god." So he's just clowning, I guess, even on his deathbed about this whole emperor cult thing. But why is he important biblically? He is the one who was responsible for putting down the Jewish revolt in AD 66 to 70. So when Jerusalem was destroyed, and as Jesus had mentioned in his prophecies, it was under Vespasian's rule. Now, it was his son, however, who was the military commander, Titus, and so he was the one actually responsible for the campaign in Judea. And when Vespasian died, Titus becomes the emperor for a short time. There is the Ark of Titus, which was built in celebration of the victory over the Jews. It still stands today in Rome. You can see that has carvings on it that celebrate that. And he is also the one who opened the Colosseum. And so it was during his reign that happens. Now, the last Roman emperor was Domitian, depending on how you pronounce it, 81 to 96. He was the brother of Titus, and he is remembered most for his brutality. He executed some of the senatorial families. He insisted on the title Lord and God, and so his brush with Christianity is that during his reign there was a lot of persecution broke out. Primarily because Christians would not call him Lord and God. Only Jesus is Lord and God. So that brought them into the crosshairs of anybody that wanted to bring them to court to have them punished. Now, if we zero in a little bit more on the political background of Judea itself, there were a few local kings that we might want to know about. Almost all of them named Herod. A lot of Herods in the New Testament, but they're different guys. So let me break those down for you for just a moment. Herod the Great was certainly the first and most famous of the Herods. I like to refer to him as the Stalin of the New Testament world. He was a Jew by religion, but an Edomite by race, and so very unpopular with the Jews. But he was a great builder. He was responsible for a lot of building projects. He did a lot organizationally to improve Judea. He was the one responsible for rebuilding the temple. It was a 50-year-long project, and he was the one who basically instigated and got that going. Also, he rebuilt the city of Caesarea, all the aqueduct systems that went around that area. If you go there today to Israel, you can still see the ruins of Caesarea, as well as the aqueducts that were all built by Herod the Great. He was also a tyrannical person, responsible for killing sons, a wife, family members, prominent citizens. And so when you read in the New Testament about, and he was the Herod that was ruling when Jesus was born. And so when you read that the infants, all the boys under the age of 2 in Bethlehem were killed, although we don't have outside confirmation of that having happened, the biblical record certainly seems to be right, because that would be in character for Herod to do something like that. Caesar Augustus actually said about Herod, he said, "I'd rather be Herod's pig than his son." So we find that Herod was quite the guy. I mean, he got a lot done, but he was also very cruel. When he died, his kingdom was divided amongst his sons, and Herod Antipas became the ruler of Galilee and Perea, and he ruled for 40 years. So he's the one we come in contact with then later on in the New Testament with John the Baptist. He's the one who had him beheaded. He's also the Herod to whom Jesus was sent during his trial. The other son, Archelaus, ruled for only a short time. Nobody liked him, and so he was deposed. And then that's why we have Pontius Pilate and being appointed governor, because Roman governors then ruled Judea after Archelaus was dismissed. So the other Herod that we come in the two other Herods we come in contact with, Herod the Great's grandson, Agrippa. Herod Agrippa was named ruler over Palestine by the Roman Emperor Caligula. He's the one who was responsible for persecuting the Christians and putting James to death, as well as arresting Peter. He's also the one in Acts chapter 12 who it says that because of his cruelty and blasphemy, the angel of the Lord put him to death. His son, Agrippa II, is the one to whom Paul appealed in Acts chapter 25 in Caesarea when he was in prison there. Agrippa heard his defense, but Paul had already appealed to Caesar, and so therefore he was powerless to free him at that time. So that gives you a little bit of an overview. You'll read more in the textbook, I'm sure, in depth, but I wanted to give you just a quick background of some of the rulers that were in the background of the New Testament.